had warned for years that a new virus could cripple the world. His predictions came true with the COVID-19 pandemic. And now his focus is on solutions with global collaboration. Our guest today is the co-founder of Microsoft and the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Bill Gates. Welcome, Bill Gates, to Doordarshan.
Thank you.
When you said in 2015 that your biggest fear is an epidemic, what signs were you reading?
Well, a respiratory virus can spread very quickly, and we travel so much now that even compared to 100 years ago, which was the last time we had a global pandemic, this would spread much faster. And so I was worried that the governments of the world weren't thinking about this, hadn't really practiced how they would quickly find the cases and try and avoid this exponential spread. Some investments were made, including India and others joined a thing called CEPI, but not enough preparation was made for this terrible pandemic.
You didn't imagine it to be as deadly as this has proven to be, isn't it?
Well, this pandemic could be worse. As bad as it is, the fatality rate could be far higher. The thing that in my 2015 talk I underestimated was the economic damage. I, at that point, said $3 trillion, and thought, wow, that's a large number. The fact that people would need to change behavior so much and the economic impact, I underestimated that because we didn't have the tools to control it, that it would be the economy that would take a lot of the pain.
All eyes are now the world over a vaccine, and we are aware that there are several efforts that are underway to have one. In your assessment, is there a possible time frame for a vaccine?
Yes, I'm quite confident that in the first half of 2021, that some of these first wave of vaccines will get approved by a top-notch regulator like the US FDA. I'm also optimistic that then we can take that vaccine and not only manufacture it in the company who created the vaccine, and those first 6 lead candidates going through a tough regulatory process are all in the West, Europe and the US, but there are some wonderful partnerships with companies in India like Serum, BioE, Bharat, who have substantial capacity to be a second source and to make those vaccines in large volume. And so we've been working with the companies on both sides, trying to be as ready as possible so we can make a lot of volume during calendar 21 and try and really bring the numbers down. And we won't be able to get the billions of doses and get them delivered until it'll take through 2022. Although in 2021, we should be able to get the highest priority work should be done. But sadly, to get billions of doses out, even to do that by the end of 2022 would be a huge achievement, very complex logistics, and we'd need the vaccines that are the cheaper, higher productivity in manufacturing, like hopefully Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca. Hopefully those succeed because there's a clear path to get large numbers of those than some of the other vaccines.
Are you fairly confident of a vaccine considering that it's been well over 30 years and we are still waiting for a vaccine for HIV?
Well, HIV is a far more difficult pathogen because of the way that it mutates. Dr. Fauci runs the group. The 2 biggest funders of the HIV vaccine work are our foundation and Dr. Fauci's group. And maybe one of these new vaccine platforms will help us with that. But yes, this pathogen, the likelihood of having quite an effective vaccine in the first half of 2021 is very high because we're pursuing a lot of different approaches, 3 different approaches in those 6 vaccines and then several others in the ones that come after that.
Whenever a vaccine is available, Bill, will it offer full protection?
Well, the allocation of the limited supply of the vaccine is a very tough problem. We don't want just to use price so that the richest countries or the richest people have that access. Figuring out how do you get it out to the people who are at risk of getting sick or transmitting, and doing that with some equity in mind. We've been gathering a lot of discussion, including with leadership in India, and this is a global problem. We want to get rid of this pathogen everywhere so it's not coming back and reinfecting countries again and again.
Could there be a scenario, Mr. Gates, that there would be multiple vaccines initially before there is a second generation vaccine that offers long-term protection?
Yes, it's likely that multiple of these vaccines will prove effective, and some may be better at preventing sickness, some may be better at blocking transmission, and we'll have to monitor as we actually get those vaccines out, making absolutely sure there aren't rare side effects, making sure that we really measure the impact. But it's possible that a vaccine that's not totally effective could get out, but then a later vaccine, we'd ask people to go back again. Now the cost and the logistics of that are not as good as just being able to pick a great one the first time. But it's uncertain. Many vaccines are like 100% effective. But these vaccines will be approved even if they're just 50% effective.
Will various countries need to realign their immunization programs just in case there are multiple vaccines initially, and then wait for the second generation vaccine and include that into their immunization program?
Yeah, so this will be what we call campaign vaccine. It won't just be young children coming in. This will be actually in the beginning everybody who's over 18, not the normal target for vaccination. And so what we want is ideally to tell you digitally where to go. We don't want large crowds standing around waiting. We want, wherever there is vaccine, we want to get it into people as quickly as possible. And some of these vaccines have very complex cold chain requirements. So using a digital tool to coordinate those things, there's been discussion in India about exactly how that infrastructure comes together, that Nanda and Neelam put forward some ideas. Actually, the thinking there in India in some ways is more advanced than in many other countries.
That sounds great. Let's come to the distribution of vaccines now. How will COVAX ensure equitable and affordable access?
Yeah, so COVAX is a facility that the World Health Organization and many other partners, including our foundation, have pulled together so that particularly as the rich countries are buying vaccines, we help them have access, but that they're paying a little extra to help finance the vaccine for the developing countries. So that co-financing piece and some donations, we should be able, using the strength of Gavi, to execute on this. We should make it that all the countries have access, and we don't have financial exclusion here, because it's to everyone's benefit to bring this transmission to an end. So that facility was to get global cooperation. We've seen some progress on it, although the US still hasn't engaged, but I am hopeful that they will, and that'll draw even more people in.
Is there a timeline or a time frame that COVAX is looking at for distribution of vaccines the world over?
Well, of course, the critical path right now is the approval by a strong regulator and having that data to show both the safety and the effectiveness. So, the starting line in some ways is in the first half of next year. Then the next critical path will be the manufacturing capacity, and that's where these second source agreements with people like Serum will be so valuable, because they are experts in making vaccines at very high volume. Then you get to the third, which is now you have vaccines being made as fast as possible. Exactly where should they go? Everyone agrees health workers are a place to start, then elderly who are at risk of dying from the disease. But exactly how that works across countries, we still have a lot of work to do, both on the resources and the prioritization rules.
Some rich countries have pre-booked millions of doses of vaccines. Can that impact distribution of vaccines?
well, you're right that the rich countries who have financed to their credit the trial work and the R&D work, which, it's great in the U.S. That's the one aspect of this pandemic where the U.S. has done the best job, is that generous financing together with CEPI, but the U.S. money is the biggest by far. Now, the factories that are part of that financing are completely dedicated to rich countries. So that, it's not an equity-driven thing. We need more resources from the U.S. To support procurement for the developing countries. And I think that will come along. The U.S. has been somewhat distracted, but some of the proposed stimulus bills do have funding that would get this buying facility through Gavi to be financed.
Whenever a vaccine is available, will a majority of the world's population need to get vaccinated for protection, or will only a certain percentage need vaccination for herd immunity?
In any country where you have widespread infection, you probably have to get to over 70% of the population vaccinated to be sure that you can't get it starting up again in significant numbers. So you need quite an effective vaccine and probably 70% of the population. What we want to do is eliminate coronavirus from humans because, it won't cross over again for a long, long time. And we'd like to go back to being able to, do large public events that, will be one of the last things to get restored. So yes, we're talking about a lot of vaccine in most of the countries. A country like China that has very few cases, that's complicated. If they think the rest of the world is getting rid of it, maybe they won't need to vaccinate their population. But most countries, including the US and India, will have to have widespread vaccination.
In your address to the Grand Challenges annual meeting, you focused on the need for greater R&D. How does a platform like that help offer solutions for future?
Yeah, our foundation sponsored an event called Grand Challenges, and it was hosted by India, although a lot of people were connected virtually. And our key partners, the Prime Minister made a great speech as part of that, the Department of Biotechnology, ICMR, Niti Aayog, all were great partners in a discussion both about this pandemic, the things you and I have been discussing, but also the R&D to be ready for the next pandemic. And that's a much more hopeful story, that we can have vaccine platforms that you could get a vaccine a lot faster than this time and have all that huge Indian capacity available for those new vaccine platforms. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that, given this tragedy, that we will take steps so the next time something like this comes along, the damage economically in health, should be dramatically less because we'll be ready to go with diagnostics, therapeutics, and high-volume vaccines.
Diagnostics have emerged as an area of concern, considering the false negatives and the false positives that are being reported. How do you suggest there can be an improvement in that realm?
Well, the scale of testing is now quite impressive. India's ramped up, the US has ramped up. The PCR test, where you take this swab and send it to the central lab to a PCR machine, those are quite accurate. There are not a lot of false positives or negatives with those. The other tests, which are more local, it's called point of care, they aren't as sensitive. So they do have more false negatives. So how we stitch all that together and get the data as we scale up to even higher levels of testing, that is going to be a challenge. But we're very lucky that the PCR test is quite an accurate test.
You talked about India's capacities. Well, India is sending therapeutics the world over. We've seen how India is helping neighboring countries with research to help fight the COVID-19 pandemic. India wants to help more countries fight this out. What more can India do, according to you?
Well, thrilled that India is participating in this global effort. And, India has these capacities, and both the government and the different parts of the government and the companies have been fantastic partners at saying, okay, how do we prepare? How do we get ready? Is it going to be the Novavax or J&J or AstraZeneca? And which one can you make in high volume? And how do we, while maintaining safety, get this thing approved very, very quickly? So all of that is in quite good shape, standing by for most likely an FDA emergency use license. So, India's to be congratulated for stepping in and thinking not just about India, although that's super important, but also about the global effort.
Initial projections hinted at the possibility of a disproportionately large number of infections in India, but that was not the case because timely interventions were made, and now the growth rate of this pandemic is plateauing here. How do you look at the way India has handled this crisis and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's leadership through it?
Well, the message about wearing masks and social distancing, I think that's quite clear in India. In a few countries like the US, it's become almost political and been confused, but in India, mask wearing, I think, is broadly accepted. The testing was ramped up. I'm sure, we can look back and see, okay, how could we have done this thing faster or that thing faster and be more ready for the next pandemic? But the government has had a clear message about activities. So, minimizing the damage, using not only that vaccine capacity that I mentioned, but also the digital benefits programs to get money out without, much in the way of lost money directly to particularly women. That foundation, the payment system that India has, that all the other countries are looking at with some jealousy because it was done so effectively.
Europe is witnessing the second wave of infections. How challenging is that?
Well, it's very challenging that people are fatigued about not seeing their friends and not having the type of gatherings that they would normally have. And so every country, was hoping that this fall the numbers would be going down instead of going up. And it's still quite heterogeneous, but in the US and many other countries, we're seeing the numbers going the other direction, including some countries that didn't have huge first waves and some countries that did have huge first waves. So we have to be quite modest about our ability to predict where this will hit. But the overall story is that the IHME forecast, which has been the most accurate so far, shows a pretty grim fall for a lot of countries.
Well, vaccines come at a cost. Not having a vaccine well in time also comes with a cost. Has the clock been set back on, say, the healthcare domain in some of the poor and developing countries because of this pandemic?
Well, yes, the ill effects of the pandemic go far beyond just the sickness and deaths from coronavirus itself. The disruption to other health activities has been quite substantial. And as you move into, say, Africa or countries that are earlier in development than India, that disruption has meant that the routine immunization coverage has gone down a lot. And so we'll see more deaths from diarrhea and pneumonia. So sadly, it's a setback in almost every respect, including other health work.
How long before things go back to where they were?
Well, I'm hopeful that in 2021, we can start to drive the numbers down, the number of deaths by having better therapeutics, the number of infections by starting to get the vaccines out to the right people. But in terms of fully going back to normal, I'd say the best case there would be the end of 2022, although restoring a lot of the economic activity, if we're smart about how it's done, mask wearing, good protocols, a lot of that we should be able to resume by the end of 2021.
United Nations member states have committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Do you see that happening by that time, considering the disruption caused by this pandemic?
Yeah, so those goals, I think, are super important. They're like the world's report card. And so every year, our foundation puts out a report to say, okay, are we making that progress? And normally it's a very positive thing because slowly but surely, childhood deaths are going down, partly because of great vaccines, malnutrition's going down. Most of those causes, those goals, you see slow but steady progress. And every year we get to talk about who's doing the best and sharing best practices. The pandemic has been a huge setback. Many of those goals we've been set back 5, 10 years. And so we're not going to be as far along as we wanted to by 2030. It doesn't mean the progress isn't still important, but when we set those goals, we did not anticipate the pandemic and the way that it would have gigantic damage to health systems and economies.
Besides vaccines, there's a lot of focus on therapeutics as well. President Donald Trump has projected monoclonal antibodies as a possible cure for COVID-19, saying he felt much better after taking it. How would you assess that mode as a treatment for COVID-19?
So far, we don't have many therapeutics. We have a late-stage immune modulator called dexamethasone, which is helpful. The monoclonal antibodies are very promising. Potentially, they could reduce death rates by over 70% if they really pan out. So many companies and our foundation are working on those trials. Potentially by the end of the year, those could be approved. Again, we'll have to worry about the cost and the capacity to make those. We don't want them just to go to rich people or rich countries. And so, our foundation's talking with all the different people with factories. We've reserved some capacity. But yes, I'm very hopeful that therapeutic will be the first one that will make a dramatic difference if it all pans out between now and the end of the year.
Are you confident that we'll be better prepared for the next pandemic?
Yes, sadly, it took a gigantic tragedy to have the voices like mine and others who are warning about this taken seriously. But I have no doubt that the tens of billions of investment that need to be made globally to have a quick response next time in every category, that will be made. And we'll come up with cooperative structures, we'll do the innovation. In fact, one positive thing to say is that innovation will help us with other diseases, including HIV, TB, and malaria. It'll help us to have surveillance. We'll have disease experts who are working on diseases like measles and polio and malaria, and they will be trained. And if there's another pandemic, they'll switch over. And so we'll have them in place with the right skills ready to go, but helping on other problems when there's not a pandemic.
These are difficult times indeed, but during lockdowns, we got the opportunity, space and time to do certain things that we wouldn't have done in normal days. People experimented with a lot of things. Did you take up anything?
Well, I'm very lucky. I have a great internet connection and a comfortable house. I'm lucky my college-age kids were home more, which at least for me was a great pleasure. Yes, I've been able to read a bit more, but the intense activity where the foundation, as an expert in infectious disease, is stepping forward to help coordinate things, it's also kept me very, very busy.
You told me last time around about your favorite book. Did you get the time to go through that again, or you chose some other book, considering that you're an avid reader?
I typically read a book or so a week. There's a lot. There's one about the cure of cystic fibrosis, which is a a medical miracle called Salt Becomes Breath. There's a lot of books about, Fareed Zakaria has one about 10 things we should do for after the pandemic. So yes, I'm getting a chance to read a lot of great books.
One of your tweets caught my eye. You're writing a book on climate change. Shed some light on that subject, and how was the experience writing it?
Well, climate change is another disaster that voters depend on governments to employ experts and make investments, so we avoid, huge damage that will come as the climate gets worse and worse. Sadly, for climate change, there's nothing like a vaccine where you can spend, a few $billion and get something that once it's distributed, brings it all to a close. Climate change is far more difficult. And so the lead time and the amount of money involved is way, way greater. So far, people have not lost sight of that as an important cause, even as we're thinking about the pandemic. And so my book talks concretely about the innovations that are required. We're not going to stop building buildings or using electricity. So we have to have ways of doing all of those activities with actually having zero emissions, which, there's no way to do that for steel or cement today. So we need a lot of R&D money, a lot of cooperation to invent new approaches.
You had predicted that a new virus would cripple the world, and that, of course, would have been based on studies and observations. Now, new studies have come in. Are you making any predictions on when this COVID-19 pandemic is going to end?
Well, without a vaccine, we'd be faced with many tens, over 10 million deaths, as that the virus circulated and, would create eventually a level of immunity. Fortunately, because our vaccine technologies are good enough, I think that's what will bring it to an end. So the critical path is that approval, high volume manufacture, intelligent distribution, and that should be doable within the 2 to 3 year time frame.
So 2 to 3 years is what we are looking at for the end of this pandemic. Thank you, Bill Gates, for joining us on Doordarshan.
Thank you.
So that was Bill Gates speaking on the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks for watching.